October 1965. On a factory floor in Farmingdale, New York, workers were still riveting fuselage panels stamped with a name that within weeks would not exist anymore. That name was Republic Aviation. 22 years earlier, this same company had built the P-47 Thunderbolt, the most produced American fighter in history. Over 15,000 units. A plane so overbuilt, so brutally tough, pilots joked it could fly home with a cylinder shot clean off. Republic didn't stop there. When the jet age arrived, they built it again. The F-84 Thunderjet, then the F-105 Thunderchief, a machine so fast and so heavily armed that Air Force planners called it the last gunfighter. Over Vietnam, it would fly more strike missions into the most heavily defended airspace in the world than any other American aircraft. And then, almost overnight, the company that built it vanished. Not through bankruptcy, not through scandal. Through a boardroom transaction most Americans never heard about. A merger that erased 6 decades of engineering, thousands of jobs, and one of the most consequential names in American air power. This is the story of how a company built the machines that won wars, and still couldn't survive the peace that followed. The company that would build the P-47 did not begin with that name, and it did not begin with stability. In 1931, a Russian émigré named Alexander de Seversky founded Seversky Aircraft Corporation on Long Island, New York. Seversky was not a typical aviation executive. He was a former Imperial Russian Navy pilot who had lost a leg in combat during the First World War, then rebuilt himself into a barnstorming aviator, an inventor, and eventually an aircraft manufacturer, chasing military contracts in a country that, in the depths of the Great Depression, had little appetite for spending on new fighters. His chief designer was another Russian émigré, Alexander Kartveli, a Georgian-born engineer with a background in aeronautical theory from Paris. Together, the two men built a series of increasingly capable pursuit aircraft through the 1930s. Most notably the Seversky P-35, which won a small but important U.S. Army Air Corps contract in 1906. It was the company's first real foothold, proof that Seversky Aircraft could compete against larger, better-funded rivals. But the company was chronically undercapitalized. Alexander de Seversky spent lavishly on sales trips, air races, and personal promotion, and by the late 1930s, the company's finances were in open crisis. In 1939, matters came to a head. The board of directors, alarmed by mounting losses, and Seversky's erratic management, forced him out entirely. He would never return to the company that carried his name into its next chapter. The board restructured the company and renamed it Republic Aviation Corporation. Kartveli stayed. He was promoted to chief engineer, and it was under this new name, with the founder gone but the engineering team intact, that Republic began work on a fighter design that would define the rest of the company's history. The timing could not have been more urgent. In Europe, war had just begun. The U.S. Army Air Corps was searching for a next-generation fighter capable of escorting bombers at high altitude, and Kartveli's team had already been sketching the outline of something unusually large, unusually heavy, and built around a single, non-negotiable idea: survivability over elegance. The company that had just survived its own boardroom collapse was about to bet everything on a fighter most of the industry thought was too big to work. Alexander Kartveli's new fighter broke almost every assumption in American fighter design. At the time, the prevailing doctrine favored small, light, maneuverable aircraft, machines built around agility in a dogfight. Kartveli went the opposite direction. His design, designated the P-47, was built around the Pratt & Whitney R22800 Double Wasp, an 18-cylinder radial engine paired with a turbo supercharger, a system that used exhaust gases to spin a turbine, forcing extra air into the engine and allowing it to maintain full power at altitudes where other fighters gasped for breath. The problem was where to put it. The turbo supercharger unit was too large to fit in the engine cowling. So Kartveli's team routed ductwork the length of the fuselage, feeding the turbine mounted near the tail. The result was an airframe that dwarfed every fighter the Army Air Corps had fielded before it. Nearly 12,000 pounds empty, more than twice the weight of a Japanese Zero. Test pilots and engineers who saw the prototype in 1941 openly doubted it could dogfight anything. Some called it clumsy, others simply called it too big. Kartveli's answer was blunt. He wasn't building a dogfighter. He was building a fighter that could dive faster than anything the Luftwaffe had, absorb battle damage that would destroy a lighter airframe, and still bring its pilot home. Where rival designs treated armor and structural mass as a penalty to be minimized, Kartveli treated them as the entire point. The prototype, the XP-47B, first flew on May 6, 1941 at Farmingdale, piloted by Lowry Brabham. Early test flights were rough. The massive airframe handled like nothing else in service, and pilots accustomed to nimble, lightweight fighters had to relearn what a fighter was supposed to feel like in their hands. But in a dive, the aircraft was extraordinary, capable of speeds no contemporary fighter could match. And when gun camera footage and combat reports began arriving from the first operational units, one detail stood out again and again. The airframe could absorb catastrophic damage, cylinders shot away, control surfaces shredded, entire sections of wing torn open, and the aircraft would still fly. Pilots gave it a nickname that stuck for the rest of its service life: the Jug, short for Juggernaut. A machine built not for grace, but for punishment. By the time full production began, the U.S. Army Air Forces had committed to an aircraft that looked nothing like what fighter doctrine had called for 2 years earlier. Kartveli's gamble, that survivability would matter more than agility, was about to be tested on a scale no one at Republic could yet imagine. Once the United States entered full wartime production, the scale of what Republic built became almost impossible to comprehend. Between 1941 and 1945, Republic Aviation manufactured 15,636 P-47 Thunderbolts, more than any other American fighter in history, before or since. The Farmingdale plant alone employed over 25,000 workers at its wartime peak, running around the clock in shifts that never stopped. A second production line opened in Evansville, Indiana, to keep pace with demand that outstripped what even Republic's home factory could produce. At the height of the war, Republic was completing finished aircraft at a rate of roughly one every hour. The Thunderbolt fought in every major theater of the war. In Europe, it flew long-range bomber escort missions deep into German airspace, its turbo-supercharged engine finally giving American bombers the high-altitude protection they had lacked. In the Pacific, its range and payload made it a devastating ground attack platform, absorbing anti-aircraft fire that would have destroyed lighter aircraft outright. By war's end, Thunderbolt pilots had been credited with roughly 3,750 aerial victories against a loss ratio that favored the P-47 by nearly 4-1. But it was the aircraft's survivability, the very quality the industry had mocked as excess weight in 1941, that became its defining legend. Combat reports and photographs from the European theater showed P-47s returning to base with entire cylinders shot away, wings punctured by flak, tail sections shredded by cannon fire, hydraulic lines severed, and still landing under their own power. One widely documented case involved a Thunderbolt returning to base missing nearly 2 feet of one wing, the pilot walking away uninjured. Ground crews began referring to the aircraft, without irony, as nearly indestructible. The turning point was not merely production volume. It was a proof of concept. Kartveli's decision to build a fighter around mass, power, and structural redundancy, a decision that had drawn open skepticism from the Army Air Corps only 2 years earlier, had been vindicated in the most literal way possible by the number of pilots who came home because the airframe refused to fail. By 1945, Republic Aviation was no longer the undercapitalized company that had nearly collapsed under Alexander de Seversky. It was one of the most important fighter manufacturers in the world, its name stamped onto a machine that had helped win a war. And then, almost overnight, the war ended. And with it, the demand that had built Republic into a giant. Victory brought Republic Aviation to the edge of collapse. Within weeks of Japan's surrender in August 1945, the U.S. government began canceling wartime contracts on a massive scale. Republic's order books, which had called for thousands more Thunderbolts, were slashed almost overnight. The company that had employed over 25,000 workers at Farmingdale saw its workforce cut by more than 90% within a year. The Evansville plant, built specifically for wartime P-47 production, closed entirely. The peacetime market offered little shelter. Commercial aviation was dominated by companies with established airliner programs: Douglas, Boeing, Lockheed, none of which Republic had any foothold in. Republic had spent the war becoming extraordinarily good at one thing: building a heavily armored piston-engine fighter for a conflict that no longer existed. That expertise, so valuable in 1943, had almost no peacetime application in 1946. Compounding the crisis was a technological shift the company could not ignore. Jet propulsion, still experimental at the war's outset, was rapidly becoming the future of military aviation. Britain and Germany had already fielded operational jet aircraft before the war ended, and the U.S. Army Air Forces, soon to become the independent U.S. Air Force, made clear that future fighter contracts would go to jet-powered designs. Republic's entire engineering identity, built around Cartveli's turbo-supercharged piston philosophy, suddenly risked becoming obsolete. The company had no significant jet engine experience. Neither did most of the American aviation industry, but Republic's competitors were moving faster. Lockheed had already flown the P-80 Shooting Star before the war ended. If Republic could not produce a credible jet fighter, and produce one quickly, there was a real possibility the company that had built America's most produced wartime fighter would not survive to build anything else. Cartveli, still chief engineer, pushed the company into jet development with what former colleagues later described as open urgency bordering on desperation. There was no luxury of a gradual transition. Republic needed a jet fighter in Air Force hands before the post-war contraction finished what Alexander de Seversky's mismanagement had nearly started a decade earlier. The result of that scramble would be an aircraft far less celebrated than the Thunderbolt, plagued by early failures, nearly canceled more than once, but one that would ultimately keep Republic Aviation alive long enough to reach the jet age at all. Republic's answer to the jet age was the F-105 Thunderjet, and its early development nearly killed the program before it reached a single squadron. Designed under Cartveli beginning in 1944, the F-105 first flew in February 1946. Unlike the P-47's dramatic vindication, the Thunderjet's early service record was defined by failure. Wing spar fractures grounded entire fleets. Engine flameouts and structural fatigue caused a string of accidents severe enough that, at one point in 1948, every F-105 in Air Force service was grounded pending redesign. For a company still recovering from the post-war contraction, a canceled jet program would have been fatal. Republic's engineers spent nearly 2 years reworking the wing structure and fuel system before the aircraft was considered reliable enough for full operational service. The Korean War, beginning in June 1950, changed the calculation entirely. The Air Force needed combat-ready jets immediately, and the now stabilized F-105 became a primary strike and escort aircraft. Thunderjets flew thousands of ground attack sorties against North Korean and Chinese forces, and later, the swept-wing F-105F Thunderstreak variant extended the aircraft's service further into the decade. The design was never as celebrated as the P-47 had been. It was not the aircraft that won headlines, but it did something arguably more important for the company itself. It kept Republic Aviation's production lines running, its engineers employed, and its name in front of Air Force procurement officers at the exact moment competitors were racing ahead in jet technology. By the mid-1950s, Republic had absorbed a hard lesson about the post-war defense industry that Alexander de Seversky's era had never had to face. Peacetime survival depended not on building the single best aircraft, but on maintaining continuous relevance to Air Force requirements, contract cycle after contract cycle. A company could not simply build one legendary machine and coast. It had to keep proving itself, program after program, against rivals who were doing exactly the same thing. That lesson would define Cartveli's next and most ambitious design. An aircraft conceived not as a dogfighter, not as an escort, but as something entirely new. A fighter bomber built for speed, payload, and a single mission profile Kartveli believed the coming era of warfare demanded above all else. It would become the aircraft Air Force pilots called the last gunfighter, and it would carry Republic's name into the deadliest skies of the Vietnam War. By the mid-1950s, Alexander Kartveli was designing his most ambitious aircraft yet, and once again, he was building against the prevailing consensus. The Air Force's emerging doctrine of the era prioritized speed and nuclear strike capability over traditional air-to-air combat. Kartveli's design, initially conceived as a fighter-bomber capable of delivering a nuclear weapon at supersonic speed and low altitude, became the F-105 Thunderchief. It was, by a wide margin, the largest and heaviest single-seat, single-engine fighter ever built for the U.S. Air Force, powered by a single Pratt & Whitney J-75 turbojet capable of pushing the aircraft past Mach 2, with an internal bomb bay and a fuselage-mounted 20mm rotary cannon. Kartveli's philosophy had not changed since the P-47, where lighter, more maneuverable designs from other manufacturers emphasized agility. The F-105 was built around raw speed, payload, and the ability to survive battle damage at low altitude and high velocity. The same core belief in mass and durability that had defined the Thunderbolt 15 years earlier. The Air Force gave the aircraft an informal nickname that captured this philosophy precisely: the last gunfighter, one of the final American fighters designed with an internal cannon as a primary weapon, built for a style of direct, high-speed combat many planners assumed was already becoming obsolete in the missile age. Early development was troubled. The prototype first flew in October 1955, and initial testing revealed persistent problems, inadequate range, aerodynamic issues, and skepticism from Air Force officials, who questioned whether an aircraft this large and this specialized for nuclear strike missions had a viable future in an Air Force increasingly focused on missile technology. Some officials argued openly that manned strike aircraft of the F-105's size and cost could not justify their expense against emerging ballistic missile programs. Kartveli and Republic pushed the design through anyway, refining the airframe into the F-105D, which added all-weather strike radar and became the Air Force's primary production variant. By 1959, the aircraft was entering full squadron service, a fighter-bomber built for a nuclear strike mission against the Soviet Union that, within a decade, would instead be thrown into a very different war entirely, flying low and fast over jungle terrain against a threat its designers had never specifically planned for. The F-105 was about to be tested in the single most heavily defended airspace American pilots had ever flown into, and the numbers that would come out of that test would be unlike anything in Republic's history. Beginning in March 1965, the F-105 Thunderchief became the backbone of Operation Rolling Thunder, the sustained American bombing campaign against North Vietnam, and it flew into an air defense environment unlike anything Republic's engineers had designed against. North Vietnam's integrated air defense system combined Soviet-supplied surface-to-air missiles, radar-guided anti-aircraft artillery, and MiG interceptors into one of the densest defensive networks any American aircraft had ever faced. The F-105, conceived a decade earlier as a high-speed nuclear strike aircraft penetrating Soviet airspace at altitude, was instead flying low-level conventional bombing runs directly into this envelope, repeatedly, over targets defended with a density of anti-aircraft fire that exceeded what American bomber crews had faced over Germany in the Second World War. The cost was severe. Of the 833 F-105s built, 397 were lost in the Vietnam War, nearly half the entire production run. A significant majority of those losses occurred during Rolling Thunder alone. Pilots and crews gave the aircraft an informal nickname, only partly affectionate: the Thud, a name that stuck through years of grinding, high-attrition missions over Route Package 6, the most heavily defended target area in North Vietnam, centered on Hanoi and Haiphong. Yet the same qualities Kartveli had built into every Republic design since the P-47, raw structural durability, the ability to absorb damage and still bring a pilot home, proved themselves again under conditions no one at Republic could have anticipated when the aircraft was designed. F-105s returned to base with battle damage that, by pilot accounts, would have destroyed lighter aircraft outright, wings and control surfaces torn open by flak. Hydraulic systems crippled, airframes punctured by anti-aircraft fire, and the aircraft still completing the flight home. The same engineering philosophy that had defined the Jug over Europe in 1944 was, 20 years later, defining the Thud over North Vietnam. The human cost, however, could not be engineered away. F-105 pilots flew some of the most dangerous missions of the entire war, and the aircraft's losses reflected it directly. A nearly 50% attrition rate against a single production run, concentrated overwhelmingly in a handful of years over a single heavily defended stretch of Southeast Asian airspace. Dozens of F-105 pilots were killed, and many others became prisoners of war, some held for years in North Vietnamese captivity. By the time Rolling Thunder ended in 1968, the F-105 had flown more strike sorties into North Vietnam than any other American aircraft of the war, a record that cemented Republic's name permanently into the history of American air power, and simultaneously marked the last time that name would be attached to an aircraft built entirely on its own terms. Because even as the Thunderchief was proving itself in combat, the company that built it was already losing a battle it could not win back home, a battle fought not with missiles and flak, but with contracts, balance sheets, and a defense industry rapidly consolidating around companies Republic could no longer outcompete alone. While the F-105 was still flying combat missions over North Vietnam, Republic Aviation was losing the fight that would determine whether it had a future at all. The mid-1960s Defense Department under Secretary Robert McNamara was reshaping how military aircraft contracts were awarded. McNamara's Pentagon pushed aggressively toward joint service programs, single aircraft designs intended to serve multiple branches simultaneously, reducing costs by consolidating what had previously been separate development efforts. The most consequential of these was the Tactical Fighter Experimental Program, TFX, which would determine the next generation of American fighter bombers for both the Air Force and Navy. Republic submitted a design for consideration. So did General Dynamics, Boeing, and several other major contractors. In November 1962, the contract was awarded to General Dynamics, whose design became the F-111 Aardvark. For Republic, the loss was not simply one missed opportunity among many. It was a structural warning. The era of a single manufacturer independently developing and winning a major fighter contract on the strength of its own engineering team, the way Cartvelli's Thunderbolt and Thunderchief had been developed, was ending. Future contracts were increasingly going to companies with the financial scale to absorb joint service program requirements, extended development timelines, and the escalating cost of supersonic jet technology. Republic did not win another major fighter contract after the F-105. The company's engineering talent and manufacturing capacity remained real, but the defense procurement landscape had shifted beneath it. Jet fighter development costs had climbed far beyond what they had been in the Thunderbolt or even the early Thunderjet era, and the Pentagon's appetite for spreading contracts across many mid-sized independent manufacturers was shrinking in favor of a smaller number of larger, more diversified contractors, capable of absorbing risk across multiple programs simultaneously. Across the broader American aviation industry, the same pressure was producing the same result. Consolidation. Smaller and mid-sized manufacturers, who had thrived during the wartime production boom 2 decades earlier, were being acquired, merged, or folded into larger conglomerates that could better withstand the financial volatility of the contract-to-contract cycle. Republic, despite the operational legacy of the P-47 and the combat record of the F-105 still unfolding in Vietnam, was exactly the kind of mid-sized single-product line manufacturer this consolidation wave was designed to absorb. By 1965, with no major follow-on fighter contracts secured, and F-105 production winding toward its final numbers, Republic's board of directors began entertaining what a decade earlier would have seemed unthinkable for the company that built America's most produced wartime fighter, an offer to be acquired outright. The company that survived the collapse of Alexander de Seversky's leadership in 1939 survived the post-war contraction of 1945, and survived the early failures of the jet transition, was about to face the one threat it could not out-engineer. In October 1965, Republic Aviation Corporation was formally acquired by Fairchild-Hiller Corporation. The transaction was structured as a stock acquisition, folding Republic into Fairchild-Hiller as a subsidiary division. For a company that had operated as an independent manufacturer for 26 years, since the boardroom restructuring that had removed Alexander de Seversky and created Republic's name in the first place, the acquisition marked the end of that independence entirely. The Farmingdale plant continued limited operations for a period under the Fairchild name, but the identity that had built the P-47, the F-84, and the F-105 was no longer its own. The reasoning behind the deal reflected exactly the pressures that had been building since Republic's TFX loss 3 years earlier. Fairchild-Hiller was a diversified aerospace conglomerate looking to expand its military aviation portfolio. Republic brought manufacturing capacity, engineering talent, and an unmatched combat record, but lacked a follow-on fighter contract to sustain independent operations into the 1970s. The merger was less a rescue than a market correction, the final quiet conclusion to a decade of consolidation that had already absorbed smaller aviation manufacturers across the country. F-105 production ended in 1965, the same year as the acquisition, with 833 aircraft built in total. It would be the last combat aircraft to carry the Republic name into production. Alexander Kartveli, the engineer who had shaped the company's design philosophy from the P-47 through the Thunderchief, retired not long after, his 4-decade career closing at almost the exact moment the company itself ceased to exist as an independent entity. Within a few years, the Republic name fled from Fairchild's corporate branding entirely. The Farmingdale facility that had once run 24 hours a day, producing a finished fighter nearly every hour at the height of the Second World War, was gradually repurposed, downsized, and eventually shuttered. Today, only a small portion of the original site remains connected to aviation manufacturing. Much of the land was redeveloped for commercial and retail use, a shopping center and office park now occupying ground where P-47s and F-105s once rolled off the line. Republic Aviation built 2 of the toughest aircraft the United States Air Force ever flew, machines that came home with battle damage that should have destroyed them, carrying pilots through the worst air defenses of 2 different wars a generation apart. It could survive combat that no other aircraft could withstand. It could not survive a boardroom.